Good Monday and good morning. You're probably used to seeing my partner Jay Brew at these sessions. He's on vacation this week and asked me to fill in for him, and I'm very happy to do that. I told Jay I'd just give our friends a quick update of economic news since we did our last video, ALCO committee video, and something to look forward to with respect to something we think might be coming down the road in the next year or two. Since we last met, we have the GDP results, and let's review those. You recall the GDP equation is C plus I plus G, X minus N, consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and exports minus imports. And what we found with the latest government GDP report, and as you all know, GDP is the lifeblood of your bank. Your assets grow, your loans grow, your deposits grow only if this grows. And each letter sort of influences the other, and you'll soon see that the consumer, which is 70% of the GDP, impacted I dramatically in the first quarter. Recall, third quarter 2013, many of us in this industry were very excited to learn that the GDP had gone up by 4.1%. This is close to being a China-like growth rate for America. And then the second quarter first estimate, and I'm showing you this to indicate that GDP results change as they get more data. And recently you've heard we got the last of the first quarter 2014 data, and it wasn't pleasant. But back in the fourth quarter of last year, we were told the GDP was 3.2, which was pretty close to the 4.1% of the third quarter. That was revised in the final estimate to 2.6. Now the first quarter, of course, we were given an estimate of almost no growth, 0.1%. This was very suspicious to many economists. They felt, how could the economy not have shrunken some given the bad weather we had in January, February of the first 2 months of the first quarter. It was subsequently revised to minus 1%, and we thought that was more like it. But nobody really was ready for what happened with the third and final estimate of minus 2.9%. And that's the worst result we've had in 5 years. If that were to continue for quarter after quarter, we would call it another recession. And I think you'll soon see, fortunately, that's not going to happen, that we think next quarter, the second quarter, which ends today, by the way, is going to be much better. What happened was we had very weak inventory growth. You can see this, the fourth quarter is circled 111.7 billion, and now the inventory growth 45.9 billion, very sharp reduction, and as you'll soon see, it's sort of a cause and effect. What hurt in the last first quarter, having growth go from 2.6 to minus 2.9, exports turned down dramatically. The housing market slumped, again we think because of the weather. But inventories and consumer spending were the real culprits. Consumer spending crashed in the first quarter. That led businesses not to restock their shelves, reduce their inventory purchased, and you can see, no pun intended, this snowball effect. Thankfully, we had an increase in government spending, mostly at the state and local level, and imports turned downward, which, as you know, raises the GDP. In terms of contribution to the minus 2.9%, consumers did contribute by 0.71 of that minus 2.9, but please note the sharp drop from the fourth quarter. Investment, mostly inventories, as you just saw, really hurt the economy last quarter, as did the foreign sector. Here are the latest numbers. We still have a $17 trillion economy, just barely. As you can see, down 17,089 to 17,016. And investment drop, the inventory change, and the export drop were the main culprits. Looking at the numbers over a long period of time, here's the GDP growth rate, which will closely match your bank's growth rate if you're a typical bank. 2.8, 0.1, 1.1, 2.5, 4.1, 2.6, and then that ugly minus 2.9. And when you graph it, you see it even more. It comes out more starkly at you. You can see the minus 2.9 in the first quarter of 2014 being completely different than the positive growth we've had pretty much back to back since 2010. Is it the snow? Was that one of the reasons, the bad weather here in the Northeast? I see three main culprits for why we didn't do well in the first quarter. A harsh winter definitely hurt car sales, consumer spending, travel, etc. But many of the states had the long-term unemployment benefits expire either January, February, or March, given the way there was a bulge some 1 to 2 years ago. And that expired and left consumers not with a lot of disposable income, and that was one of the reasons we saw the growth rate in consumer spending drop. And lastly, as I mentioned, the restocking of shelves just wasn't necessary because the consumer spending didn't match expectations of business. So these three items, the weather, expiration of long-term unemployment benefits, and the fact that inventories did not need to be replenished, probably caused this minus 2.9%. Having said all that, don't be surprised if you see a GDP growth rate for the second quarter, the one that ends today, to be 4 to 5% growth. I would say at the very top end, we might get lucky to get 5%. You recall, the first number won't be the last. There'll be three different estimates, the third one being the one that we put in the record books. In terms of forecasting economic growth the rest of the year, we have the new Fed forecast, of course, from June. And they're still forecasting GDP for 2014 to be positive in the 2.1 to 2.3 range, down from the 2.8 to 3% range. And notice 2015 improving back to 3%. So they've taken into account the first quarter, and this is probably why they reduced their forecast. Looking at the forecast in more detail, you can see the Fed thinks, some people think the Fed GDP is going to grow 2.4, and some think it's going to be 1.9, and everywhere in between is a possibility. How about short-term interest rates? Quickly, well, are we ready for higher rates? Again, reviewing the Fed forecast from 2 weeks ago, you'll notice 12 people think out of 16 on the Fed FOMC committee that rates will rise in 2015. 3 think it's not going to be until 2016 that we're going to increase interest rates. And there's one straggler who thinks that sometime this year rates will be increased. But most of the betting is next year or the year after. And when you look at it from a standpoint of how much they'll go up, boy, there's a big range as you can see. For 2014, there's one person who thinks they'll go up this year to about 1% from 0 today. For 2015, there's one person who thinks they'll go up as high as 3%. And repeating the chart from the ALCO committee slideshow, looking at how many people think the rate will be the same in 2015, 50 basis points, 75 basis points, 1%, you can see the people voting in each of the prescribed boxes. In other words, there's great uncertainty as to how much the rate will go up. There's not uncertainty as to whether or not it will go up. What many people realize it's going to be up in 2015 on the Federal Open Market Committee. There's just disagreement by about how much. Which leads me to a new topic. Quick introduction. I know I'm taking more time than Jay Brew normally takes. I hope you hang in there with me, because I think you're going to see this coming down the road. And as a banker, you should understand it, at least the rudimentary parts of it. The previous slide, let me go back to it, should upset you. These are our leaders in the banking field. These are the members of the Federal Open Market Committee. And while they agree that rates will rise next year, they don't agree by how much they'll rise at all. Well, the rules versus discretion debate at the Federal Reserve would sort of settle this issue. If you think the Fed should be run by rules, which it is not, it's run by discretion, the rule group or the rule camp believes there should be in stone very strong rules that would prescribe what the interest rate should be for the banking sector. These rules would be in place and only changed in very, very strange circumstances. The discretion debate feels that it would tie their hands needlessly and it wouldn't be necessary. The head of the rules camp is Charles Plauser from the Philadelphia Federal Reserve. He recently said in a speech just last week, by systematic policy I mean conducting policy in a rule-like manner as opposed to relying on discretion. In a rule-based approach, the decisions are guided by the rules. Discretion is the opposite of rules-based decision-making. Discretion decisions are made without being constrained by past promises or previous forward-looking statements. Why would a rule be better than a discretionary system? And the reason is it gives better results. It's more stable. Policies characterized by commitment to rules rather than discretion have been shown by almost every research study there is, you have more economic stability. So look at a country that uses rules in their monetary policy setting of interest rate. One that uses discretion, the rules have more stability in macroeconomic variables. If you do a rules-like approach, because businesses and consumers are more forward-looking, you get credibility and a commitment to the rule. And lastly, to get a rule-based monetary system, a rule-based banking system, you need to describe what we call reaction function. And this is where I'm going to lose some of you. But that's okay, because I'm going to keep hammering this notion of reaction function to you until you understand what Charles Plauser and others are suggesting. A reaction function would describe how the current and future interest rates should respond to economic conditions. In other words, if economic conditions change, the interest rates are going to change. And everyone's going to know by how much they're going to change. The most popular rule is called the Taylor rule. It's the best known reaction function out there. John Taylor was a professor at Stanford, and he wrote a paper on rules about 20 years ago that's become the seminal paper with respect to rules. His reaction function indicates how to set the interest rates as a function of if the actual inflation rate deviates from a target inflation rate and the actual unemployment rate deviates from a policy target rate. Or instead of using unemployment, you could use GDP. In other words, what GDP should grow by versus what it actually grows by. Actually, Taylor's rules, when put into numbers, pretty much describes what we've been doing over time. Now, here's where I'm going to lose some of you. There are basically many, many different kinds of rules out there. The very first one, of course, was Taylor from 1993. He updated his own rule in 1999, and there's another set of rules by other economists over the period. And even the Philadelphia Federal Reserve, they have what they consider the best rule. This math, all this math up here, isn't really that difficult. Let's look at the first rule, the Taylor rule, the simplest rule. Taylor says that the interest rate, any given interest rate, should be 2% plus the rate of inflation. So if inflation is, say, 2%, which is pretty much the target rate, then the Fed funds rate of interest would be 2% plus 2%, or 4%. If the target rate is 2%, 2% minus 2%, the actual minus the target is 0. That makes this term 0. If the GDP, which is income, expressed by letter Y, if the preferred GDP is actually the actual GDP, this term becomes 0. And the Fed funds rate under normal circumstances would simply be, let me take you back, 2 plus 2%. These two terms would no longer be in play because they would be something multiplied by 0. So what you do is you take the forecast of where inflation's going, where GDP is going, you plug in what the goals are, and you come up with what the appropriate inflation rate should be. Using the Taylor function, it's pretty much like this. Interest rate should be 2.1% plus 1.3 times the inflation gap minus 2% times the unemployment gap. Now, the Philadelphia Fed has recently taken these equations that you've seen and estimated where the interest rate should be using the different rules. Here's the fourth quarter of today. This is today's interest rate, roughly 0. And looking at the forecast going forward of inflation and GDP growth, you can see by the end of 2015, these rule-based indicators would show a interest rate somewhere between 1.5% and 3.5%. This is a much smaller gap than the discretionary gap that you saw on the previous slides. Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure to substitute for Jay, and I hope we get to meet again soon. Thank you.